Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take that huge stack of detailed research, all those articles and historical accounts you thought you needed months to get through, and distill it all into the knowledge you need right now.
And today, today we are taking, I think it's fair to say, a sledgehammer to some of history's most persistent and, frankly, most romantic myths. The sources we've got in front of us provide this astonishing level of pragmatic, granular detail that just forces us to look past all the shine and spectacle.
That's exactly right. Our deep dive mission today is really a two-part historical reality check. First, we're starting on the medieval battlefield, and we're going to challenge basically everything you think you know about the knight. Specifically, why that iconic sword was so often considered the absolute last choice in a fight.
And then after that, we pivot, and it's a dramatic pivot to the imperial courts of Rome and Byzantium. We're going to show that performance and psychological strategy were far, far deadlier weapons than any blade could ever be.
We're really moving from the tactical necessity of a war hammer, a tool designed to crush bone and metal, to the psychological warfare that was orchestrated at, say, Emperor Nero's banqueting table.
And the central question that kind of weaves through all of this is efficiency. I mean, why, if the medieval sword is the undisputed symbol of chivalry, did most knights probably deeply regret every single decision that brought them to the point where they finally had to draw one?
Okay, so let's unpack this with the cold, hard facts that the material gives us. Because if you visualize a knight riding into battle, drawing this massive gleaming sword and looking heroic, you're imagining a scene of just massive inefficiency. That romantic image, it just doesn't align with the physics of armored combat.
The sources are remarkably clear on this. The sword was not the star of the show. It was, at best, barely the supporting actor.
Barely.
It really occupied the role of the break glass in case of emergency option. And let's be honest, in a medieval context, when you're breaking that glass, whatever's inside usually breaks you right back.
That's such a good point. And the sheer logistics of failure that had to happen before you even drew a sword. It's kind of staggering when you think about it.
Oh, totally. Using your sword meant everything else had gone catastrophically wrong.
So your primary weapon, the lance, that's splintered and gone. You tossed it aside.
Right. Your spear, if you had one, that snapped in the chaos. Your shield is probably lost, trampled into the mud somewhere behind you, and now you're standing there, completely winded, gripping 3 pounds of shaped steel and thinking, okay, this is it. Plan Z.
And the historical combat manuals, the so-called Fechtbücher, they don't show these glorious, elegant duels we see in the movies, do they?
Not at all. I mean, what they show is 2 men locked in a brutal wrestling match. A Hollywood sword fight looks like this beautiful but deadly dance.
A waltz with blades.
Yeah, exactly. Real medieval combat, especially with swords, looked more like, and I love this description from the sources, 2 exhausted construction workers arguing over a blueprint, and one of them happens to have a heavy tool.
And the main reason for all this pragmatism, this ugliness, really, is plate armor.
Right.
By the time the knightly class was at its peak, blacksmiths had pretty much solved the problem of being cut.
They really had. So swinging a sharp sword edge against a piece of curved, hardened plate steel was, as one source puts it, the medieval equivalent of knocking aggressively on a door that would absolutely never open.
I love that. It's just futile.
It is. Armor didn't politely open up when you struck it. It just dispersed the force, absorbed the blow, and, kept the man inside relatively safe. And knights weren't stupid. They were military professionals operating in this incredibly high-stakes environment. They understood the physics of momentum versus hardened steel.
So the solution wasn't to cut the armor.
No, the solution was to get past the armor.
Okay, so if you can't cut through the steel, where do you aim? What's the new target?
You aim for what the medieval manuals sometimes call the pathetic little spots.
Pathetic little spot.
Yeah, the places where the steel couldn't fully protect the person inside. So you're talking about the armpit gussets, the gaps at the elbow, the throat openings, the visor slits, the groin flaps. You're aiming for a weakness that might only be a half-inch wide, and you're doing it under extreme duress.
And that kind of precision, that's not something you can achieve with a big, wild swing.
No way. Which brings us to probably the single most uncinematic yet completely necessary technique in the knight's entire toolkit: half swording.
Right. For anyone listening who's used to seeing swords held only by the hilt, this detail is it's utterly shocking.
It absolutely should be. Half swording means the knight literally grabs his own blade, yes, the sharp part, with his gauntleted hand.
He grabs the blade itself.
He does. And he uses the sword essentially like a short, stiff spear or maybe a specialized lever You choke up on the blade, holding it roughly halfway down, and you use the very tip to stab.
And the purpose here is all about precision and, I guess, desperation. If you can't cut, you turn the blade into this focused, guided, penetrating point.
That's it. The sword becomes a tool for leverage and jabbing, and you're aiming for those tiny gaps like you're trying to thread a needle through a moving target, while someone is simultaneously trying to push you into the mud.
And this detail immediately corrects that common fantasy idea, that medieval swords had these razor sharp edges.
Exactly. If they were that sharp, half swording would instantly sever your fingers, even through the best gauntlets.
Right.
The sources clarify that the edges were definitely sharp enough to be deadly against an unarmored opponent, or cloth armor, but not so razor fine that thick leather gloves or plate gauntlets couldn't provide a secure grip.
That distinction is so crucial. It shows that the sword was engineered not for some kind of slicing beauty, but for practical, brutal engagement against a whole variety of targets. The grip you get from the gauntlet wasn't just for protection, it was for leverage.
And what's really fascinating is the sheer pragmatism of it. I mean, half-swording conserved crucial energy. Swinging a heavy sword with full force for 5 minutes, let alone in an hour-long engagement, would turn your arms into, like, wet noodles.
You'd just be exhausted.
Totally. But holding it close allows you to use your body weight for leverage, to ram the point home with far less energy. The training manuals, they show knights wrestling, prying open visors, or even using the pommel, the heavy knob at the end of the hilt, like a hammer, to knock opponents senseless.
So we've established that the sword, while it's incredibly symbolic, was often functionally, inadequate against the very threat it was supposed to counter.
Right.
So if the sword was the polite, socially acceptable side of medieval violence, the chivalric romance, we absolutely need to talk about the true armor breakers.
Well, if the sword was the romance, then the mace was definitely the divorce papers, served with extreme prejudice.
That's a great way to put it.
Maces were the aggressive, bone-crunching greeting. Knights carried them for the simple reason that the invention of full-plate armor made the sword an expensive, glorified letter opener in a close-quarters fight.
So I have to ask, why did the mace lack the status of the sword? Was it just about the skill required, or was it the perception of the kind of violence it inflicted?
That's an excellent question, and I think it speaks directly to the class structure of the time. The sword carried centuries of symbolism with it: status, honor, wealth, the exclusivity that comes with complex training.
It was an aristocratic weapon.
Absolutely, the mace carried none of that. It was designed purely for function. Hitting someone in armor with a mace wasn't about finesse. It was about delivering an irresistible, crushing force.
A mace didn't need to cut or slice or pierce to be just devastating. It relied purely on blunt impact.
Yes. A strike with a heavy, spiked, or flanged mace delivered this massive shockwave. And even if the armor wasn't pierced, which it often wasn't, the force was transferred directly to the tissue and bone underneath. The goal was blunt trauma, concussive force, massive internal injury.
And the denting of the armor itself, that was a secondary but still incredibly effective result.
Oh, absolutely. A well-placed mace strike could dent plate armor so severely, literally crushing the metal inward, that even if the knight wasn't killed by the impact, he'd be instantly immobilized. He wouldn't be able to move the crushed metal away from his ribs or his joints.
Wow.
The sources describe these victims as having to be extracted like a misaligned puzzle piece after the battle is over. It was a crippling rather than a clean way of neutralizing someone.
And the training advantage is a huge point we need to emphasize here. Swordsmanship, that took years of expensive apprenticeship under a master. It was a luxury only the wealthiest could really afford.
Compare that to the mace. The basic training principle for using a mace effectively was essentially lift mace, move mace quickly toward enemy, repeat until enemy stops moving.
A bit more straightforward.
To put it mildly, it was training focused on simple momentum and geometry, not on years of complex fencing forms. It really lowered the economic barrier to entry for highly effective violence, which is why you see foot soldiers and less wealthy knights favoring them so much.
And there's a psychological factor too, isn't there? Seeing a man charge at you with a sword, that suggests a possible duel, maybe a chance for surrender.
But seeing a man charge at you with a mace, that signals he's not there for honorable combat or a good time. He is there exclusively for permanent solutions.
Maces were weapons of brute force necessity, despised by Hollywood for being so unglamorous, but adored by knights for being terrifyingly effective.
And if the mace was the aggressive brick, The Warhammer was what happened when a dedicated weapons engineer decided to make that brick smarter, specifically for the job of killing armored men.
Okay, so this is an evolution.
Exactly. The Warhammer represents a step up in tactical sophistication. It was engineered to solve the problem that even a mace could sometimes fail to penetrate the thickest parts of, say, a breastplate. Real medieval Warhammers were compact, often long-handled, and they typically featured two functional ends.
There's a blunt hammer face for the impact, and then the key innovation. A narrow, vicious spike, often curved like a bird's beak. The bec de Corbin.
That spike was not decorative. It was a concentrated point of medieval science. It delivered all the force of the user, their body weight, their momentum, maybe even the speed of their charging horse, into a minuscule, needle-like tip. This maximized the pressure, the force per unit area.
So a good strike from a Warhammer spike didn't just dent or bounce off. It was designed to punch through armor joints or deliver a focused blow that could puncture a helmet or compromise the breastplate.
And crucially, the narrow spike was designed to be withdrawn with relative ease. Unlike an axe, which might get wedged deep into a wooden shield or soft tissue, the Warhammer spike was engineered to penetrate and then release immediately. This let the knight move on to the next target quickly.
Speed and efficiency.
In the chaos of combat, speed and efficiency were everything. The Warhammer was the great equalizer against the most expensive, most advanced armor of the time.
That transition leads us perfectly into the rest of the true battlefield toolkit, which seems to be dominated by weapons focused on utility and range, not glory, like axes.
Right. If swords were the celebrities, axes were the part of the arsenal that said, I didn't come here to impress anybody. I came here strictly to ruin someone's entire lineage. And knights absolutely used purpose-built combat axes. We're not talking about the heavy lumberjack kind. These were much sleeker, faster.
They really were the power tool of combat. The design concentrated all that force into a narrow, sharp edge, which made them superb for cutting through the protective layers that might stop a sword, like chainmail or padded armor.
And when you combine that with the momentum of a mounted knight, that concentration of force could split a helmet or punch through a wooden shield with terrifying speed.
But it's their versatility that made them so indispensable, isn't it? Many had that back hook, the bearded axe head.
And that hook wasn't for chopping. It was for entanglement.
That's where the tactical complexity really comes in. What was the purpose of that hook?
It was all about grappling utility. The hook could be used to yank a shield out of the way, which gives the knight a clean, open shot at the torso. It could drag an enemy off his horse, instantly neutralizing a mounted threat.
The psychological feeling of a hook just latching onto your shield must have been terrifying, like a medieval tow truck suddenly pulling you off your ride.
It completely throws your balance off and drags you into a close quarters fight that you absolutely do not want. And, as you mentioned, they were great at destroying wooden obstacle shields, barricades, spear shafts.
And they were economical, too. A swordsmith would charge a fortune for a finely balanced blade, but a functional axe head was simpler, cheaper, and faster to produce in volume.
Okay, so now we have to give the proper credit to the true, unsung winners of medieval conflict. Spears and lances.
Right.
If the sword is the celebrity, the spear is the underpaid, overworked background actor who is holding the entire production together with sheer competence.
The history really shows that spears won more battles than every sword used in Europe combined. They were the IKEA furniture of medieval combat. Simple, functional, cheap, and surprisingly durable when you use them en masse.
And their key advantage was, quite simply, reach. In a sword fight, your enemy is close enough to smell your fear. In a spear fight, you are stabbing people who are 2 meters away. You're maintaining distance.
And that distance keeps the danger manageable. It also eliminates the need for years of complex, close-quarters fencing training. Medieval generals loved them because you could quickly equip and train massed infantry to form this impenetrable hedge of points.
And then on horseback, the lance was just optimized for a single destructive purpose.
Exactly. The lance on a hearse was a controlled delivery system for a massive amount of kinetic energy. And our sources confirm this is one of the few things Hollywood often gets right. Lances were specifically designed to break and splinter instantly on impact.
They were meant to dissipate that overwhelming kinetic energy immediately after transferring the initial shock to the enemy. It's a brilliant piece of engineering, really.
A charge was truly a controlled car crash, aimed directly at the enemy line. So the lance was disposable, a one-use shock weapon designed to break enemy formations and scatter infantry, creating chaos that could then be exploited.
And once that lance shattered, which would happen roughly every 30 seconds during a full-scale charge, The knight immediately ditched the remnant and drew something functional for the close-in fight. Usually that was the mace or the warhammer.
So if the spear was the simple, reliable tool, then the poleaxe. The poleaxe was the entire kitchen drawer of violence strapped to a sturdy stick.
That's a perfect description. The poleaxe was the sophisticated multi-tool born out of necessity. Medieval engineers realized that if every fight devolved into grappling, they needed one weapon that could defeat every type of protection. So they strapped an axe blade on one side, a hammerhead on the other, and a mean-looking spike sticking out the top.
And the whole shaft was often reinforced with metal strips called langets.
Yeah, to prevent it from shattering during, let's say, enthusiastic negotiations.
It truly was the Swiss Army knife of combat. It could chop with the axe blade, smash with the hammer side, stab with the top spike, and hook or pry with the back of the axe head. It worked against mail, plate, or no armor at all.
The poleaxe did not discriminate. The hammer side dented metal like it was aluminum foil, the axe side chopped through shields, and the spike was just perfect for finding that miserable little gap between armor plates when you were wrestling.
And I think we need to emphasize its utility in that grappling environment, because at the end of the day, the design speaks to the reality that every fight ended up on the ground.
That's right. The grappling utility was key. Knights used the hook to yank enemies off balance, to pull their shields aside, or to drag them close for a finishing stab. If you got caught by a poleaxe, you were now the unwilling star of a medieval wrestling match, except your opponent had a giant murder stick that could kill you 6 different ways.
In a messy world of armored fury and sweating, sophisticated engineering won more fights than art ever could.
And finally, when even the multi-tool was too clumsy, we come to the final personal finisher, the dagger. Our sources emphasize that the dagger was this is about to get personal and inefficient tool.
Because every fight devolved into 2 heavily armored men rolling around in the mud like furious turtles.
When you're wrestling in 60 pounds of steel, swinging a sword is simply impractical. You need something short, stiff, and controllable. You pull out something stabby that is designed to exploit those crucial weak spots, the neck openings, the eye slits, the armpit holes.
And the specific design of these daggers is so telling. We're not talking about a steak knife here. One of the most infamous types was the rondelle dagger.
The rondelle dagger was often a thick, square, or triangular spike. It wasn't designed for cutting at all, but purely for punching through things. It looked like a medieval ice pick, specifically engineered to be inserted between armor plates and driven home with maximal efficiency. It was the medieval equivalent of a precision screwdriver, designed to make someone stop breathing, easily driven by a gauntleted fist.
And as we touched on earlier, the dagger wasn't only for murder, it was a vital utility tool for survival cutting rope, carving wood, preparing rations, and in one recorded case, performing battlefield surgery.
Though I hesitate to imagine what that looked like.
Me too. It was the final required tool for finishing a job.
Before we transition, though, we really need to completely dismantle that myth of the clumsy knight just lumbering around like a tin can. We've seen a lot of material about the armor itself, and the truth about mobility and grappling is far more complex.
Let's get technical about the armor weight. A full suit of plate armor weighed roughly 40 to 60 pounds. That's comparable to the weight carried by a modern infantry soldier today.
And critically, that weight was distributed incredibly well across the body. This allowed trained knights to run, to jump, to climb ladders, and even perform maneuvers that we'd consider pretty athletic today. They didn't waddle, they power waddled.
Mobility was not the main enemy then.
No. The true problem was endurance and heat. Wearing a full steel shell meant you were walking around in a steel oven. It was a massive energy drain. It caused extreme fatigue and constant sweating, sometimes leading to heat stroke long before an enemy weapon even got close.
And the chaos of the battlefield just made all of this worse.
Completely. Wrestling or grappling was standard training, and the goal was always the same. Get the enemy on the ground, where gravity becomes the ultimate medieval weapon.
Once a knight was down, the armor that protected him now trapped him. He's thrashing helplessly like a beetle flipped onto its back, just waiting for a dagger to find a vulnerable gap.
So it wasn't a world of elegant duels. It was a crowded, muddy free-for-all, where visibility was terrible. Helmet slits were often the width of a pessimistic smile. Death came frequently from exhaustion, from heat stroke, or simply from being trampled by the chaos, not necessarily from a glorious sword fight. Survival depended on pragmatic awareness, endurance, and knowing exactly when to ditch the iconic tool for the functional one.
And that tactical awareness, that necessity of choosing the right, unglamorous tool for survival is the perfect bridge to our next segment. If the battlefield required trading the romance of the sword for the pragmatism of the mace, what did imperial rule require? We move now from the struggle of the knight and the steel oven to the struggle of the empress in the gilded cage, where the weapons were wit, defiance, and strategy.
And we are diving into the world of Empress Theodora, a figure whose rise from the most scandalous origins imaginable to the absolute pinnacle of power is one of history's greatest examples of political genius and, frankly, sheer audacity. Her story proves that performance and strategic reinvention were the true weapons in the imperial court.
And we begin in the chaotic political arena of the Hippodrome.
Right. Theodora, born around 500 CE, did not begin her life in marble halls. She was the middle daughter of a man named Acadius, who was a bear trainer for the Green faction in Constantinople.
And we need to understand that these racing factions, the Greens and the Blues, they were far more than just sports clubs.
Oh, much more. They were armed political beasts, like street armies with massive influence. They could often determine the course of riots and rebellions.
So her childhood was spent learning the language of the crowd, the roar of the Hippodrome, and the brutal reality of what happens when patronage fluctuates.
And when her father died suddenly, poverty struck with the swiftness of a plague. Her mother was left with 3 daughters and no protection in a city that was defined by status. She knew that desperate measures were needed.
So in this moment of just sheer theatrical desperation, her mother marched the girls into the Hippodrome, dressed them in garlands, and had them beg for support from the rival Blue faction because the Greens had abandoned them.
And this moment, as humiliating as it must have been, was also utterly theatrical. And it was Theodora's first massive lesson. She learned that survival depended not on birthright or status, but on commanding the attention of the masses, on forcing people to look at her, and on understanding that performance could elicit sympathy, even from your enemies.
So the stage became her training ground. By her early teens, Theodora was an actress and a courtesan. And the sources are crucial here, showing this wasn't just a scandalous career choice, it was an education in high-level human psychology.
The theaters and performance halls of Constantinople were these loud, rowdy, politically charged spaces. Performers weren't just reciting lines. They had to captivate, improvise, and navigate these unpredictable crowds full of intoxicated aristocrats and volatile political figures.
So she's sharpening her wit, refining her instincts.
And mastering the priceless art of reading a room and manipulating its moods. She learned how to reinvent herself nightly, refusing to be contained by any single definition.
But that intense fame and influence came with a social stigma that was almost impossible to shake off. She was abandoned and deeply humiliated by a provincial governor named Hybulus in North Africa, stranded far from home.
And this betrayal became the defining moment of her life. It was a furnace that hardened her resolve from just a performer into a genuine political strategist. Her long journey back to Constantinople wasn't a retreat, it was a strategic transformation. She survived by her wits, observing politics and power structures all across the Byzantine Empire.
And when she finally returned, she understood that her scandalous reputation was a political weakness that could be weaponized against her.
So she made this incredibly calculated move that must have shocked the entire city. She withdrew from the theater completely and started earning a quiet, respectable living as a wool spinner.
It was brilliance. It immediately distanced her from her infamous past and allowed her to reshape her reputation from infamous to pious and respectable.
In a world where status was defined by perception, this period of quiet, manual labor was the most strategic political move she could have possibly made. It effectively neutralized years of gossip.
And it was during this period of deliberate rebranding that destiny intervened. She met Justinian, the ambitious heir to the throne.
And he was a man who had risen through talent. He saw past her reputation and recognized the exceptional political mind and the unshakable resilience that lay just beneath the surface.
Their bond was immediate and intense, but they hit this insurmountable legal wall. Roman law expressly forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses.
So her past made her legally unmarriageable to the man who was destined to rule the empire. And this wasn't just a social norm. It was a deeply ingrained legal structure designed to protect the wealth and lineage of the senatorial class from being polluted by women of low status or, questionable history.
This is a critical point that the sources really highlight. Justinian didn't just ignore the law.
He rewrote it.
An extraordinary political maneuver that must have required either immense influence or just immense political will.
It was both. Justinian didn't just ask for a favor. He mounted a massive legal campaign. He amended the marriage laws so that actresses and courtesans who abandoned their former professions and lived respectably could marry freely.
And this required convincing a deeply conservative Senate to overturn centuries of precedent.
By forcing this through, Justinian didn't just affirm his love for Theodora, he signaled to the entire empire that she was destined for the pinnacle of power, and that he was willing to defy the entire Byzantine elite to get her there.
So when Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora was crowned empress right beside him, sitting on the throne not as an ornament, but as a full partner. Her composure was such that even the bitterest critics among the aristocracy had to acknowledge her raw, intelligent political capability.
But her defining moment came 5 years later, the Nika Revolt of 532. This was a massive, violent rebellion where the green and blue factions, the very group she grew up watching, united against Justinian.
Constantinople was literally burning, and the mobs were screaming for the emperor's deposition.
Justinian was terrified, exhausted, completely overwhelmed. He gathered his council and prepared to flee across the Bosporus to save his own life. His council advised retreat, believing the situation was utterly hopeless.
And Theodora refused to run.
She stood up and delivered a speech that historians record as being not theatrical flourish, but pure steel. She directly challenged the cowardice of the male council and the emperor himself, stating that wealth and life were transient, but glory endured.
She uttered that now immortal line, declaring she would rather die in purple, referencing the imperial color of her robes, than live in exile, hunted and humiliated.
Her defiance was the spark that the court needed. It instantly restored Justinian's will to fight.
And the result was swift and brutal. Inspired by her courage, Justinian ordered his general Belisarius to execute a counterattack in the Hippodrome, where the rebels were gathered.
It was a slaughter. An estimated 30,000 rebels were killed in a single day. It secured the throne and ensured Justinian's reign would continue for decades. And history is unified on this point. Theodora saved the empire.
Her influence just exploded after that, but unlike someone like Nero, she used her power for genuine reform. She used her position to strike at the cruelties and vulnerabilities that she had experienced firsthand.
She became this formidable champion for marginalized women. She pushed through reforms that secured harsh penalties for forced prostitution. She closed brothels, and she funded safe houses for former courtesans who wanted a new life. She didn't just preach. She created concrete, protected alternatives.
Furthermore, she fundamentally improved property rights for women, securing their inheritance rights, land ownership, and resistance to forced marriages.
She confronted a world that had tried to break her, and she used her political influence to rewrite its rules, ensuring that vulnerable women had lasting protection for centuries after her death. Even in her death in 548, her mark was indelible. Justinian was devastated and continued their work, codifying their legal reforms. Her legacy was immortalized in the glorious mosaics of the Hagia Sophia, robed in imperial jewels, a permanent declaration that her scandalous past would never erase the political power she commanded.
And we transition now from an empress who used calculated performance to rescue the marginalized, to an emperor who used spectacle as a psychological weapon to terrorize the powerful, Emperor Nero. The contrast in their use of strategic performance is, frankly, chilling.
To receive an invitation to one of Nero's banquets was, yes, a massive mark of status, but it was also a guarantee of danger. His dining halls weren't simple spaces for eating. They were architectural performances designed to overwhelm the senses and declare his divine status. He wasn't just the emperor, he was the god of the feast.
And the sources detailed this architectural ambition that just mirrored his ego. His later banqueting halls, particularly in the sprawling Domus Aurea, the Golden House, which was built after the Great Fire, they were designed to be impossible to ignore.
Just consider the revolving ceiling. It was an engineering marvel, rumored to have these complex, hidden gears, causing the dome to rotate slowly like the heavens themselves. And from this architectural godlike height, showers of rose petals would descend.
And the air itself was choreographed, pumped full of rosewater, cinnamon, myrrh, expensive saffron.
It sounds beautiful, but the terror starts when that abundance becomes oppressive. The sources mention that the rose petals sometimes fell so heavily they actually suffocated guests.
That is a profound act of cruelty disguised as luxury.
It's the ultimate expression of power. Nero's message was, I control life and death, even through beauty. I can kill you with a flower. Silver fountains gushed wine, often infused with honey and spices, illuminating the room with this ruby glow. By the time guests settled onto their ivory couches, they were already psychologically compromised, witnessing a level of extravagance that just screamed, divine privilege.
So the invitations were coveted, but also dreaded. a golden summons promising massive luxury and inherent risk, and the guests were forced into a performance of their own.
Absolutely. They were compelled to perform delight, devotion, unending appreciation. They knew that any misstep, too much laughter, too little applause, failing to look appropriately awestruck, could be fatal. Their entire evening was a continuous calculation of risk.
And the seating arrangement was purely political. The favored courtiers were positioned closest to Nero's central throne-like couch.
While the cautious, the politically suspect, or the soon-to-be condemned, sat quietly, just hoping their anonymity would save them. But Nero rarely let anyone remain unnoticed for long.
The culinary cruelty was a key part of the spectacle. Nero believed food should be as shocking as it was delicious. The dishes were designed to symbolize his domination over nature and the endless reach of the Roman Empire.
This wasn't simple indulgence. We're talking about gold leaf dusted on oysters, floating on imported mountain ice, peacocks roasted whole with their iridescent feathers, painstakingly reattached, exotic imports like flamingo tongues, and dormice stuffed with extensive pine nuts. The cost alone was designed to humiliate anyone who couldn't replicate it.
But the horror was deliberately theatrical.
Oh, completely. Rare fish were served, still twitching from the sea, displayed for shock value. Dishes were sculpted into grotesque mythological shapes, like hydras made of layered meats. And here is the true political test. Refusing a dish was considered an insult, equating to a rejection of the emperor's divine abundance. Guests had to eat no matter how sick and repulsed they were, all while Nero watched them closely, gauging their forced admiration.
And once the eating portion was done, the entertainment just intensified the psychological pressure.
The night might begin with dancers, but it quickly shifted to long, uncomfortable tragedies that often featured plots mirroring or mocking Nero's own life and reputation. This forced his guests to participate in the political commentary while pretending to be entertained.
And of course, Nero performed himself, singing long, elaborate arias while demanding frantic validation.
The guests applauded until their hands stung, because survival required maximum enthusiasm, regardless of the quality of the performance. Silence or hesitation was interpreted as political rebellion.
Then came the truly dark shows that cemented the atmosphere of terror.
Exotic animals paraded in chains, condemned prisoners forced to recite poetry before being executed in the adjacent garden, or gladiators demonstrating combat techniques uncomfortably close to the dining couches. The message was indisputable. Nero controlled not only art and luxury, but life and immediate brutal death. The feast was a theater of fear.
And as these feasts became marathons lasting until dawn, the line between a social event and political captivity just completely blurred.
Endless wine consumption, orchestrated by servants who faced severe punishment if a cup went dry, dulled the senses of the guests. Yet Nero remained watchful, viewing exhaustion, a stumble, or even a yawn as potential rebellion. The entire atmosphere was a psychological battlefield where intoxication was just another weapon.
These banquets were his primary tools of political domination.
He often introduced controversial political ideas, new taxes, public attacks on his rivals, announcements of brutal punishments, while his guests were intoxicated, exhausted, and strategically unable to protest effectively. It's impossible to challenge the emperor while you're lying on a couch under a shower of rose petals and high on honeyed wine.
He also used them to systematically strip the Roman elite of their dignity. He forced senators, men who held the highest offices of the Republic, to perform, to dance, to sing, to engage in humiliating drunken games.
The real feast for Nero was watching Rome's elite swallow their pride and their fear in equal measure. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a test of submission. Failure to perform meant political or literal death.
And as his reign continued, the banquets grew darker, saturated with paranoia.
The rumor of poison became the quiet ghost, haunting every gathering. Guests had to constantly watch their cups, desperately hoping their personal food tasters were not secretly part of Nero's fatal performance. To be too eager to drink suggested flattery. To be too cautious suggested conspiracy. There was no middle ground.
After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, Nero's extravagance became just, grotesque, and defiant. While the city lay in ashes, he hosted feasts that defied empathy, unveiling the Domus Aurea, his golden house, a fever dream of marble and gold leaf built over the wreckage.
He intensified celebrations, often using colors and lighting that mimicked fire, proving he was either mocking the tragedy or was completely incapable of distinguishing performance from disastrous reality.
In his final years, the magnificent setting remained, but the atmosphere became desperate. The applause he demanded was frantic and strained. His voice trembled with the strain of trying to convince the world and perhaps himself that he still commanded devotion.
His final great banquet ended abruptly when the illusion of worship shattered completely. The extravagance could no longer mask the total collapse of his power. Within days, Nero fled and died alone, deprived of the audience and the applause he had demanded like oxygen for so long. His banquets, once symbols of absolute power, became terrifying warnings of how spectacle descends into unsustainable tyranny.
This brings us back to our starting point and lets us really synthesize the two historical realities we've explored today.
Exactly. We've been on two very different journeys of survival: the physical combat of the knight and the political combat of the imperial court. And the common thread revealed by our deep dive is that true power and long-term survival depend entirely on pragmatic awareness over iconic ideals.
Real knights were tactical, efficient killers. They utilized a complex toolkit of necessary violence maces, axes, lances, grappling, because they recognized that the cinematic ideal of the sword was functionally useless against the advanced armor of the day. They chose functional tools over symbolic ones.
And similarly, rulers like Theodora and Nero showed that ultimate imperial power was secured not by raw military might alone, but by strategic performance. Theodora used calculated, life-saving defiance during the Nika Revolt, and then weaponized her past experience to reshape the law in favor of the vulnerable, turning social stigma into enduring influence.
Conversely, Nero weaponized luxury and spectacle to psychologically torture the powerful and demand submission, using architecture and food as tools of absolute control. He required his audience to constantly validate his power through forced applause.
In both the battlefield and the imperial court, survival depended on knowing when to ditch the iconic tool for the one that actually works. The knight knew when to drop the revered sword for the pragmatic mace. Theodora knew when to abandon the theater stage for the strategy of the law books.
So, what does this comprehensive look at reality versus myth mean for you, the learner, navigating our modern, information-rich world? We've seen how emperors use spectacle and illusion, the revolving ceilings, the forced applause, to control perception and reality. We've seen how knights prioritized brutal efficiency over cinematic ideals.
So here's the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. We are constantly bombarded by idealized symbolic imagery, the swords of modern life, if you will. In our own performance-driven world, what is the modern equivalent of half-swording? That unglamorous, realistic maneuver, often requiring us to grip the painful or inconvenient truth that we need to make to cut through the surrounding performance, ignore the distracting ideals, and survive the resulting information confusion.
Think about what functional tool you need to pick up instead of the symbolic one you're being told to wield. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into history's hidden pragmatism.
We hope you leave feeling a little more well-informed and perhaps a little more tactical in your approach to information. We'll see you next time.